I'm Camille, 30 years old. My cousin Brielle raised her champagne glass across the oak brunch table and said, "We've decided to move forward without you, Camille. The store will be in better hands now." Not one person spoke up. Not my uncle. Not even the aunt who raised me after my parents died. I built that bookstore from the ground up, restored every dusty shelf, cataloged every rare volume. But now that it was finally profitable, they cut me out. Quietly. Permanently. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever been erased by the very people you sacrificed for, trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. The silverware clinked too politely for what had just been said. "We've decided it's best if you take some time away from the store," Brielle said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "It's not personal, Camille, it's just business." I sat frozen, a half slice of blueberry toast cooling on my plate. My aunt sipped her mimosa and refused to meet my eyes. My uncle folded his napkin with deliberate care, as if the corners of a cotton square mattered more than the girl they'd raised. Raised, but never truly claimed. I had poured 6 years into Rhodes and Sons, the old bookstore they let rot for a decade. I restored the floors, negotiated every lease renewal, learned bookbinding from scratch, and cataloged every single first edition we salvaged from the mildew. When tourists finally started lining up outside the coastal shop for author events and history tours, Brielle breezed in from Portland with her leather satchel and soft voice and began introducing herself as the co-owner. Now she sat at the head of the family table like it had always been hers. I should have known something was wrong when she insisted on this celebration brunch. She wore the pearl earrings I once gave her for her graduation, a gift she never thanked me for, and smiled like she'd already forgotten where they came from. "We'll make sure you get something for your time," my aunt added gently, finally glancing my way. "You've been instrumental. Not partner, not family. Instrumental. Like a ladder they no longer needed to climb higher." I turned to my uncle. "You said I'd inherit the business, that it was mine to grow." He cleared his throat. That was before Brielle's strategic plan took things to the next level. Her pitch impressed the town council and the investors. Investors? No one had told me there were investors. I wasn't even looped into the last renovation meetings. My hands, which had painted the original shop signs and filed LLC paperwork at midnight with blistered fingers, had been quietly excluded. "It's already done," Brielle said, tucking a stray blonde hair behind her ear. "The deed is in my name, and we've rebranded to Brielle and Company. Elegant, isn't it?" I stared at her, at the table, at the faces I had trusted with the best years of my life. No warning, no vote, just a quiet decision behind closed doors. The betrayal didn't roar, it whispered. My body didn't shake, it stilled. I stood up, napkin still folded on my lap, and said nothing. No scene, no cry, just a final glance at the store's new heiress. "Thank you for brunch," I said, my voice like cut glass. "You won't have to see me again." And I meant it. As I walked away from the table, from the porch, from the house that smelled of lavender and false promises, no one followed. Not even Brielle, especially not Brielle. She had gotten exactly what she wanted. Or so she thought. Most people didn't know the condition Rhodes and Sons had been in before the tourists came. When I moved into the tiny loft above the shop after college, there was black mold in the back room, a collapsed ceiling in the archive wing, and a pigeon nest in the fiction aisle. My aunt and uncle had written the place off as a relic, a burden too nostalgic to sell but too broken to fix. They let me stay there because I didn't ask for much. I took evening shifts at the docks, cleaned the shop at sunrise, and taught myself how to digitize the ledgers and catalog rare volumes. Every inch of progress came in silence. No congratulations, no press releases. I didn't care. I wasn't building it for praise. I was building it for legacy. For the stories my grandfather used to read to me before he died. For the creak of wood floors, the smell of binding glue, the pride in creating something enduring. Brielle, meanwhile, was doing a semester abroad and posting filtered pictures from Vienna cafes. She didn't call once the year our uncle fell off the ladder and fractured his spine. I handled the shop, the hospital paperwork, and the accounting all alone. When she did return, she took photos by the freshly restored stained glass windows and called them heritage moments in her captions. I watched quietly as she attached herself to the narrative I had authored in sweat and silence. At the last town festival, I overheard someone call her the visionary behind the shop's comeback. I didn't correct them. I had stopped correcting people a long time ago, but I never stopped keeping records. Emails, receipts, building permits, even the first logo draft she had later claimed as her own. I archived it all, as if part of me knew a reckoning would come. Still, when they removed me, I didn't resist. I left the keys and the ledger. I let them win. At least, that's what they thought. Because while they celebrated my absence, I was already reaching out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who still believed in the truth buried in paper and ink. The only person my grandfather had ever called a guardian of stories. And this time, I wasn't asking for permission. I was asking for fire. Silas Thatcher wasn't the kind of man you called twice. He was the one the family never talked about at holidays, the uncle by friendship rather than blood, the radical archivist my aunt once called a danger to polite legacy. But I remembered how my grandfather trusted him enough to leave him the original business ledgers when everyone else wanted glossy brochures. When I called, he didn't ask what had happened. He just said, "Meet me where the wind hits sharpest," and hung up. That meant the North Cliff, just past the broken lighthouse, where the old caretaker's cottage leaned like it was listening for something. When I got there, he was already outside. Black wool coat buttoned to the neck, silver hair swept back like it had been cut with a blade, not scissors. He didn't hug me, just nodded. "They pushed you out?" I nodded. Without a sound. "Then we start with silence," he said. Inside his cottage was a world the Rhodes family had long buried. Handwritten town records, rejected manuscripts, abolitionist pamphlets sealed in glass, even the original print press from 1886, oiled and ready. "I've been waiting for someone to get angry the right way," he said, lighting the stove. "Not with fists. With facts. I told him about the erasure, the rebranding, the insult of watching Brielle speak in panels about legacy she never lifted a hand to build. Silas poured 2 cups of black tea and didn't interrupt. "You still have your hands," he said simply. "Let's put them to use." We spent weeks gathering, scanning, restoring. I brought strategy, he brought history. Together, we unearthed what polite society had tried to forget. Truth printed in the margins of sanitized versions. That's when the idea was born. Not to resurrect Rhodes and Sons, but to build something they'd never see coming. A press without apology. A home for the silenced. A brand with no nameplate, just integrity. I asked Silas what to call it. He smiled. "You already did. Mariner's House." And just like that, the black sheep wasn't a warning anymore. He was the architect of a rebellion. One I would finish. Quietly, precisely, completely. We didn't build Mariner's House Press for attention. We built it because truth needed somewhere to live. Silas and I worked in silence, surrounded by ink-stained paper, aged type blocks, and the steady rhythm of the hand press. Our first project wasn't flashy. a reprint of lost essays from Gray Harbor's first Black educator, whose original manuscripts had been deliberately left out of the town's archive. We stitched the bindings ourselves, printed in small batches, and gave copies to local teachers, pastors, and librarians. No launch party, no hashtags, just stories returned to the people they belong to. The community took notice, but not through headlines, through whispers. People passed the books from hand to hand, left them at ferry stops and barbershops, read them aloud at church meetings. In a town obsessed with presentation, we were doing something radical, offering substance without spectacle. Meanwhile, Brielle unveiled her legacy expansion project, a lifestyle collection of throw pillows, branded teas, and journals filled with empty quotes that sounded profound but meant nothing. The local paper praised her for revitalizing the family name. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Our name wasn't on packaging. It was in the footnotes of Restored Truth. We didn't rent billboards. We earned trust in the quietest ways, by preserving voices others had erased. When the town council opened applications to restore the historic print house, I saw my chance. Not for revenge, but restoration. Brielle applied first, promoting her vision of a heritage-themed co-working cafe. I smiled when I read the flyer. Let her decorate. I would preserve. While she edited the past into something charming, I planned to publish it raw and unfiltered. We weren't competing for property. We were fighting over who got to define what legacy really meant. And I was done letting anyone else write that definition for me. The Gray Harbor Cultural Trust's hearing room wasn't made for spectacle. But the moment Brielle walked in with her curated entourage and branded presentation boards, you'd have thought it was a TED Talk. She wore cream linen and a mic'd collar, her tone crisp, polished, soaked in buzzwords. Our goal is to preserve the aesthetic of the past while making it accessible for a modern consumer experience, she said, gesturing toward a slide labeled The Rhodes Revival Project. The crowd murmured politely. Some applauded. They didn't know yet that it was a stage, not a legacy. I sat 4 rows back, in a navy coat and worn boots, my hands folded around a leather folio filled with more than marketing slides. When the chairwoman called the next proposal, she hesitated on the name. Mariner's House Press, represented by Camille Rhodes. Heads turned. My name landed like a cold gust across a summer garden. I rose without theatricality. No slideshow, no entourage, just paper. What we're proposing, I began, isn't a brand activation. It's a reclamation. This building, I held up a photograph of the original abolitionist press crew, was once a voice for the silenced, not a boutique or a novelty store, a press room for resistance. I handed out facsimiles of suppressed publications from the 1800s, preserved through Silas's collection. Brielle's proposal is beautiful, but history isn't always beautiful. It's honest, and if we erase its teeth, we rewrite its victims. Brielle shifted in her seat, her smile tightening. She hadn't seen this version of me, the one who spoke not to be polite, but to be heard. One board member, an older woman who'd once been denied access to the Rhodes store as a child, flipped through the papers slowly, her eyes wet. This building deserves a future with a memory, I said quietly. And the memory deserves to be unfiltered. During closing comments, Brielle attempted recovery. Camille's passion is admirable, but let's be realistic. Historical narratives need polish to reach wider audiences. Emotional truth is not the same as factual integrity. Tell that to the women who handwrote resistance journals in that very building, I replied, or the dock worker whose memoir you called too regional to publish. Her eyes flickered. She recognized the reference. It was the same manuscript she'd rejected 2 years ago, now our bestseller. The board requested a recess. The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It crystallized. Outside, I saw Brielle on the phone, pacing in designer boots. She glanced at me once, then looked away. She knew the tide was shifting. Not because of vengeance or volume, but because truth, once spoken clearly, couldn't be dressed in lifestyle gloss and sold back to the people it once erased. When the board reconvened, the chairwoman stood solemnly. By majority vote, we award stewardship of the historic print, house to Mariner's House Press. The room broke into whispers. Silas placed a hand on my shoulder and said nothing. Brielle stood frozen in place, no dramatic exit, no rebuttal. Just a woman who'd thought the past was hers to curate, watching it return to someone who remembered it in full. The morning after the board's decision, I arrived at the historic print house with Silas, a new set of brass keys in my hand, and a local reporter already waiting on the curb. "Is it true?" she asked, notepad raised. "You're reopening the press as a community imprint?" I nodded. "Not reopening," I corrected. "Restoring. Its voice was never supposed to be silenced." That afternoon, the Trust held a press conference on the courthouse steps to officially announce the partnership. I stood beside Silas, our hands ink-stained from sealing commemorative pamphlets for the event. A small crowd gathered, town officials, local writers, descendants of the original press operators, and a few curious onlookers who recognized me now but couldn't quite place the context. That would come soon enough. Just before the announcement began, Brielle arrived. Late. She wore sunglasses and a tightly tailored blazer, flanked by two PR interns carrying leather binders they had no more use for. I watched her scan the crowd, eyes landing on familiar faces that now looked at her with polite distance instead of allegiance. When the mayor introduced me as the new cultural steward of the historic print house, a hush settled over the crowd. My name hadn't been spoken in a room like this for years, not since the family had pushed me out, quietly and permanently. I stepped to the microphone and didn't smile. "Most of you know me from somewhere," I said. "Some of you think you know my story." I held up the original Rhodes & Sons ledger, pages yellowed and cracked. This business was built by sweat and silence. For years, I thought silence meant strength, that if I worked hard enough, I wouldn't have to fight for recognition. I looked toward Brielle. But silence doesn't protect legacy. It buries it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I placed the ledger down and opened a fresh book, our first Mariner's House Press volume. We're here today to begin again, but not by erasing the past. We'll publish what was never allowed. We'll restore what was hidden. And we will do it without asking permission from people who only show up when the cameras do. Brielle stepped forward then, uninvited. "Camille," she said, voice sharp through the mic. "You've made your point. But twisting our family's work into your own brand of bitterness is beneath you." I met her eyes. No. What was beneath me was being erased by people who knew exactly what they were doing and thought I'd stay quiet forever. A few people gasped. One reporter raised their phone, recording now. "We're not rewriting history," I said. "We're telling the parts you edited out." Brielle opened her mouth to respond but said nothing. Not because she lacked words, but because, for once, no one around her was nodding. The applause didn't come in a wave. It built slowly, like a storm rolling in. By the time I stepped away from the mic, people were clapping in full. Silas handed me a printed card, our mission statement, and said quietly, "You didn't burn the old house. You just built something taller beside it." As the crowd dispersed, the mayor approached and whispered, "Your grandfather would be proud." I nodded, not out of sentiment, but completion. Brielle stood alone by the edge of the courthouse lawn, her interns already stepping back. She looked at me like she wanted to speak, maybe even apologize, but we were beyond that. The story had already been printed. And this time, the name at the bottom was mine. I didn't return to the family home after the victory. I didn't need to. The historic print house became my anchor, the place where silence was replaced by record, where history was no longer dressed up for comfort. Some days I worked alone, curating old journals with gloves and magnifiers. Other days I stood before school groups and explained what publishing meant to people who were once denied even the right to read. I never saw Brielle at another cultural event. Her lifestyle brand quietly faded, her press appearances dried up, and her partnerships dissolved when it became clear that authenticity couldn't be mimicked in post-production. A few locals still whispered about us in bookstores and at marina cafes, trying to understand what had really happened. But I didn't offer gossip or revenge stories. I offered publications. Real ones. Printed proof of voices that had been ignored for generations. Silas and I began mentoring young editors, passing down skills no longer taught in digital courses. We didn't talk about what we'd lost. We talked about what could still be protected. One evening, I lit the original furnace in the basement, the same one used by abolitionists who risked everything to tell the truth. I sat beside it and read my grandfather's final letter, the one Silas had kept sealed all these years. In it, he wrote, "If they ever turn against you, don't waste your fire trying to burn them down. Use it to light a press." I folded it neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and shelved it beside the first volume of our new collection. That was the legacy I claimed, not through a fight, but through quiet construction. Some people inherit names. Others forge their own, one page at a time. I chose the latter, and never looked back. In a world that often romanticizes family loyalty, this story reminds us of a hard truth. Sometimes, the deepest betrayals come not from strangers, but from the people who claim to raise us, love us, and guide us. Camille's journey is not just about reclaiming a bookstore or exposing a selfish cousin. It's about reclaiming identity, value, and voice, after being quietly erased by those who benefited from her silence. Her story teaches us that legacy is not inherited. It's built, protected, and sometimes rebuilt from the ashes. When Camille was cast aside, she didn't scream, beg, or collapse. She walked away, not to disappear, but to reappear stronger, more defined, and unshakably grounded in truth. This story also teaches that revenge doesn't have to be loud, theatrical, or cruel. It can be exact, measured, and deeply personal. Camille didn't need to destroy Brielle. She simply outgrew the system that tried to contain her and built something more honest beside it. Brielle lost her power not because Camille took it, but because she was exposed for never having earned it. That is poetic justice in its purest form. Sometimes, forgiveness is self-liberation, but other times, silence is the sharpest knife. Camille didn't lash out. She didn't need to. She let her work, her truth, and her quiet refusal to be erased speak louder than any confrontation ever could. That's a powerful lesson. You don't owe peace to people who profit from your pain. In real life, many of us feel trapped in roles defined by others, minimized in our own families, overlooked at work, or guilted into keeping quiet to keep the peace. This story encourages us to set boundaries without apology, to document our truth, and to know when it's time to stop seeking approval from people who never intended to give it. How to get started today. 1. Write down one moment where you felt unseen or dismissed, and what you wish you had said or done. 2. Make a list of skills, projects, or stories you've built that no one gave you credit for. Then think about how to share or use them under your name. 3. Ask yourself, if I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable, What would I create next? If this story made you think about your own worth, your voice, or the legacy you're building, leave a comment and tell us what part hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're ready for more stories about quiet power and true justice, subscribe and stay with us. There's more coming.